It's said that animals often feel and perceive far more than humans. This story of an unusual wolf, who refused to leave a young woman's side in a most unexpected situation, attests to that. What doctors discovered shortly afterward revealed a truth as shocking as it was heartbreaking. When everyone arrived to see Julia, a radiant young woman, they anticipated she'd be walking down the aisle, glowing in her wedding dress. Instead, she lay motionless in a coffin, dressed in that same beautiful gown, but with no life left in her. Friends and family filled the room, their hearts heavy with grief. Julia had been so full of life, her wedding only days away, and it was impossible for her loved ones to reconcile her vibrant memory with the image of her lifeless body. Tears filled their eyes as they mourned her lost future. Suddenly, a large wolf dashed into the room, surprising everyone as he leapt straight into the coffin, lying close to Julia as though he were standing vigil. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsettled by the wolf's presence. John, Julia's fiancé, looked on in confusion and irritation. He approached the wolf and gently tried to coax it to leave. But the wolf, unmoved by John's words, stayed resolutely at Julia's side, refusing to budge. As John looked at the wolf, memories of his life with Julia flooded back, specifically of the day they had met. Julia, a passionate lover of nature, often found solace in the forest. Her walks were an escape from the noisy, crowded city that only seemed to aggravate her epilepsy, a lifelong condition she carefully managed. One day, during a break from a long hike, Julia had set up camp in a small clearing, resting in her tent when she heard a soft, distressed sound nearby. Stepping out, she saw what looked like a tiny, vulnerable puppy, exhausted and alone. Julia's nurturing instincts kicked in immediately, and she approached the tiny creature, only to realize that it wasn't a puppy at all, but a wolf cub, frail and shaking. A sense of urgency swept over Julia as she scanned her surroundings, aware that a mother wolf could be nearby and might see her as a threat. But as minutes passed, no wolf came. Julia quickly understood that the cub had been abandoned or orphaned, its small frame barely able to hold itself up. She couldn't leave it there to fend for itself, so she took the cub in her arms and brought it back with her, deciding to help it survive. Julia nurtured the young wolf, whom she affectionately named Charlie, by feeding it warm milk and wrapping it in soft blankets. The wolf cub soon drifted off into a deep, peaceful sleep. Yet Julia knew the limitations of what she could do. A wild animal like Charlie would grow into a large, untamable creature one day. For his own safety, he'd need proper care and rehabilitation to return to the wilderness. The next morning, Julia contacted the nearest wildlife nursery, where a kind, knowledgeable worker named John welcomed Charlie with open arms. John, sensing Julia's bond with the cub, assured her that she could visit Charlie any time. Relieved, Julia began visiting the nursery frequently, bonding with both Charlie and John, whose warmth and understanding quickly won her over. Over time, their mutual affection grew beyond friendship, and John became a special part of Julia's life. The bond between John and Julia deepened as they spent more time together, united by their love for animals and nature. Together, they watched as Charlie grew from a small, helpless cub into a strong, healthy wolf. They laughed over his wild antics, each feeling a shared pride in his transformation. Eventually, John and Julia fell in love, and soon John proposed, asking Julia to marry him. Julia joyfully accepted, her heart full of excitement for the life they would build together. But fate had other plans. Only days before the wedding, tragedy struck. John came home one evening to find Julia in bed, unresponsive. His heart raced as he desperately tried to wake her, but she lay still, her body cool to the touch. Devastated, he called emergency services. When the doctor arrived, he confirmed John's worst fears: Julia had passed away in her sleep, likely due to complications from her epilepsy. John was crushed, his dreams of a life with Julia shattered in a single moment. He knew she'd want to wear her wedding gown, and so he arranged for her to be dressed in it, the beautiful dress now her final attire. On the day of her funeral, loved ones filled the room, grieving the loss of a bright life taken far too soon. John's heart ached as he looked at his bride lying there in her wedding dress, their dreams of happiness now empty promises. Wanting to give Charlie a chance to say goodbye, John allowed the wolf to enter the hall. But what happened next caught everyone by surprise. The wolf ran immediately to the coffin, his eyes full of distress as he looked upon Julia's still form. He climbed into the coffin beside her, refusing to leave despite John and others trying to pull him away. Charlie's behavior was strange, almost unnatural, as though he sensed something the rest couldn't see. John, deeply unsettled, began to wonder if Charlie knew something they didn't. Realizing that something was amiss, John contacted emergency services once again, explaining the wolf's odd behavior. The doctors, initially doubtful, agreed to examine Julia's body at John's insistence. One doctor, noticing something peculiar, looked closer and quietly summoned his colleagues. After a few moments they lifted Julia from the coffin, placing her carefully on a stretcher. With hushed urgency they took her to an ambulance, leaving John bewildered and desperate for answers. At the hospital, doctors worked intensively to assess Julia's condition. It was then that a senior doctor explained to John the shocking truth. Julia had not been dead, she had been in a cataleptic state, a rare condition sometimes associated with epilepsy. This condition can slow the heart and breathing to a barely perceptible level, mimicking death. It even causes muscle rigidity, making the body appear lifeless, as though rigor mortis had set in. If not for Charlie, Julia might have been buried alive. Hours passed as the doctors worked to revive her. It was an excruciating wait, but finally they managed to stabilize Julia's condition, and slowly she began to awaken. John's heart soared with relief as he watched her eyes flutter open, her gaze unfocused but alive. He held her hand, whispering her name, overwhelmed with gratitude and love. Julia, still weak and disoriented, listened as John explained what had happened. As she absorbed the story, she looked over at Charlie, who stood by her side, watching her with gentle, steady eyes. Tears filled her eyes as she realized that her life had been saved by her loyal wolf. In the days that followed, Julia's strength returned. Doctors assured her that, remarkably, she had not suffered any permanent damage. The ordeal only strengthened her bond with John and Charlie, both of whom had been by her side through the darkest of times. Shortly afterward, John and Julia finally celebrated their long-awaited wedding. Family and friends gathered no longer in sorrow but in joy. And this time Julia walked down the aisle radiant, wearing the same dress that had nearly become her funeral attire. John waited for her, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. Beside him stood Charlie, proudly wearing a flower garland around his neck, a true member of their family and the honored guest at the wedding. As Julia and John exchanged vows, she cast a thankful look at the wolf who had saved her life, forever grateful for the bond that had transcended words, connecting them through love, loyalty, and the unspoken understanding that sometimes animals can feel and see far more than humans ever could. The story of Julia, John, and the wolf named Charlie would live on as a reminder to everyone of the mysterious yet powerful connection between humans and animals, a bond that, in this case, had truly been a matter of life and death.